everyone, and welcome. Can you please turn off your cell phones before we start? Just a little reminder. My name is Karen Hoover, and I'm the director of the MA in Writing program. And I'd like to welcome everybody here and thank you all for joining us tonight at our thesis reading. This is the first in-person gathering we've had in 2 years, and it is so nice to see everyone and to be joined by our folks who are also zooming in. This is our first blended reading. So I ask for your patience as we navigate some of the technology in this all-inclusive event. This class is particularly significant to me because it is the first class where I think I've read every single application as students sought admission to the program and every single thesis as they concluded their time in the program. And while I would not say that that engenders a sense of maternal pride, that sounds a little too gendered for my taste and too nurturing perhaps for what I think of the experienced students have in our program. It's true, we're not the Marine Corps. And true, we tend to politely couch things as questions. Can you come up with a better verb than was? Or suggestions? Consider recasting this from passive voice. What we're really doing here is pushing our students. In every essay, article, short story, or book chapter, we are insisting, take it up a notch. And then again, another notch. Can you make this sharper, more concise, funnier, more eloquently phrased, we demand, even if it's couched as a question. And that can be hard to hear. All writers really want to hear when they share a piece is, this is perfect, or this is the best thing you've ever written. Alas, we faculty rarely say that. Instead, we push. What if you change the order here? Or what if this was a scene instead of exposition? Or why don't you try switching this from first person to close third? Well, the natural impulse here is to groan or grow defensive. I did not see that with this group of students. These students, without exception, have entered into the writing and revision process with open minds and a willingness to genuinely hear the feedback and then to dive back in to wrangle and wrestle with their manuscripts. It has paid off. Each of our readers here tonight has completed a 50 to 70 page thesis of high quality writing, and I have no doubt many of them will see this work published. Some already have. And this work doesn't happen in a vacuum. This happens because parents, partners, siblings, friends, coworkers, babysitters also recognize the value of this work. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of students, each of these friends and family members who maybe helped with tuition, unloaded the dishwasher, or put the kids to bed when it technically was not their turn, who read a novel chapter or an essay or the same article for the gazillionth time and gave feedback, for supporting these students in ways large and small. Could these family members and friends please stand for a round of applause? Thank you. And now, could our faculty members please stand? Well, to thank our faculty, so many have joined us here today in person or on Zoom for sharing their considerable expertise with students and giving so generously of their time. I know this is time that always comes at the expense of their own writing because they care deeply about their students. The time is a gift graciously given, but I know it is not without sacrifice. So thank you to all of the faculty members here. Finally, I'd also like to thank our alumni for joining us today. Our alumni are part of our vibrant literary community in Baltimore and DC, and indeed around the country, as we have added an online component to our program in recent years. And I'd urge our students to connect with them, as they are the ones hosting reading series, networking events, and monthly write-ins, as well as editing literary journals, volunteering as writers in the schools, and participating in writers groups that endure long after their time in the program ends. Thank you to our alum for giving back to the community and keeping the literary flame alive. Now, I will turn the podium over to faculty member Ed Perlman, the Master of Ceremonies this evening. Thank you.
Well, thanks all of you for being here tonight. After the last 3 thesis readings, when all of us had to participate on Zoom, I find being here with a live audience, and of course with the Zoom audience as well, really exhilarating. It's just wonderful to have a live event again. So once more, I thank all of you for showing up and supporting our soon to graduate readers. In her essay, The Reader as Artist, Toni Morrison writes that Alice in Wonderland combination of willing acceptance coupled with intense inquiry is still the way I read literature. Slowly, digging for the hidden, questioning or relishing the choices the author made, eager to envision what is there and what is not. In listening and in reading, I surrender to the language, enter it, that I see clearly. The writers you will hear this evening have themselves entered into the language, making the difficult choices of diction, mood, tone, and theme, as well as character, plot, argument, and dialogue that combine to create the stories and narratives, both fiction and nonfiction, they'll share with you this evening. Tonight, you'll journey to New Zealand and to Russia's remote Far East. We'll be closer to home in the meadowlands of New Jersey and in DC, Baltimore, and suburban Maryland, where we'll traverse domestic landscapes. We'll make an Appalachian detour, and you'll encounter a Florida swamp creature, a menacing fiend, brought to us by Liza, who is with us this evening, and of course, a flying dragon before the evening's over. As fun and entertaining as Tripping the Light Fantastic may be, we know that darkness is also a part of our world. Chronic illness, death, loss, and grief also make appearances this evening. Tonight's readers have completed a rigorous program of study, as Karen was telling you, that includes workshops in which they've heard the criticism of their peers and instructors, criticism that reveals the strengths and weaknesses of early drafts, that provides a point of departure for revisions, and it gives our students a keen ability to recognize what succeeds and what doesn't within their own work. Each of these readers has used this final course to discover new sight, a new vision for work created throughout the program, and to polish the writing that you get to enjoy this evening. I'm going to introduce our readers tonight in 3 groups. So I will introduce our first 5 readers and ask that when our first reader, who is Samantha Schlimm, when our first reader finishes, our second reader, Mary Beth Stuller, will come right up and take over. Then I'll return again to introduce our second group of 5 readers. But to begin with, We have Samantha Schlim reading from her nonfiction manuscript. Mary Beth Stoller reading fiction. Raquel Gomes, nonfiction. Melissa Pascal, Melissa Pascal reading nonfiction. And our final reader in our first group is Drew Crowder, reading from his fiction. And Drew will come to us via the magic of a recording. I believe he is now in Mexico and unavailable even to link into Zoom. But we have Drew's recording, and thanks to Karen and our IT people, this should work. Okay, so Samantha, if you will come up and get us going.
Hey, hello.
You may have turned it off. It's blinking red and green. There.
Okay.
Hello.
There we go. Perfect. I'm Samantha Schlem. I'll be reading from the first half of an essay about the intersection of family, food, and language. Gabagool, in other words, you probably think I say wrong. My husband Joseph thinks I pronounce most Italian foods wrong. You see, in my family, we don't start a meal with antipasto. We start with antipasto. We never pronounce the O. We chop the vowels at the end of the supposat, gabagool, prosciutto, and mozzarella. Then heat them next to nutty marinated artichoke hearts, briny pitted olives, sweet pickled peppercini, and smoky roasted red peppers. When we eat, we don't get quiet like most families. Each voice fights to break through. A melodic crescendo that starts as a murmur and swells into a roar. Red and white serving trays, oval and elongated rectangles with rounded corners, whirl around the table. Skip cousins groan and complain, sitting elbow to elbow, buzzing as we spoon food from platters to plates. At the first Christmas Joseph spent with my family, I passed him a platter and asked, "Do you like gabagool?" What? His lips curled in a knowing smile. Is this one of those things like how you say mozzarella wrong? I don't say it wrong, but you probably know it as capicola. Why don't you just say that? Because that's wrong. There's no G in capicola, he said. Shh. I nudged some of the meat onto his dish. Eat. I'm only a quarter Italian, but I was raised on pasta and the fragmented pieces of a passed down culture. My dad's dad was half German and half Irish, and his mom was 100% Italian American. Growing up in the late 1960s and 70s, my dad and his siblings spent Sundays with his mom's family in Jersey City, New Jersey. One narrow row home held his Uncle Dee, Aunt Bernie, their two daughters, his Grandma Anna, and his great-grandma, Grandma Hoboken. What was Grandma Hoboken's first name? I asked my dad. It was Grandma Hoboken. Yeah, but I can't put that into Ancestry.com. Everyone called her Grandma Hoboken. Her name was Carmela. She had an alliterative native name like me, Carmela Colicchio. Who was she? This woman who carried her language, food, and our family's future to America. My dad remembers her as a tiny woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Ancestry.com thinks Grandma Hoboken and her husband, Francesco, were from Mont San Giacomo, a village about 100 miles from Naples and 35 miles from Salerno. She traveled to Ellis Island in 1908 along with 10,000 other immigrants, staring up at Lady Liberty's raised arm and her new greenish bronze complexion. Ellis Island officials denied just 2% of immigrants entry. No one needed a passport or visa. Carmela didn't receive an ID or any new paperwork. After standing in a long line of women, she most likely gave her information to a translator who barely understood her, went through a medical screening, and was sent on her way. Free to build a life in her namesake, Hoboken, with little more than her family's recipes and words. For centuries, Italy existed as disconnected states, principalities, and kingships, each with its own dialect. Based on where she grew up, Grandma Hoboken probably spoke Neapolitan, but in 1861, 3 decades before she was born, the country united and the Tuscan dialect became Italy's official language. At the time, 90% of Italians couldn't read or write. Many of them never traveled, so why stop speaking their local languages? Although children studied standard Italian at school in the mid-19th century, they spoke their own dialects the rest of the time. It wasn't until the late 20th century that radio, television, and movies made standard Italian actually standard. In the early 20th century, many of Grandma Hoboken's neighbors came from different regions of mostly southern Italy: Sicily, Naples, Campania, Calabria. Even though they all immigrated from Italy, they spoke different dialects. Italian immigrants throughout the tri-state area found similar ways in the way they dropped vowel sounds at the end of words, or in the way they used O more like ooh. And then there was the way every Italian only pronounced voiced consonants versus voiceless. Voiced consonants vibrate like bees trapped behind the vocal cords. If you put your fingers on your throat, you can feel them buzzing. Whereas voiceless consonants flow and whoosh like a stream from lungs to mouth. You only use your tongue, teeth, and lips when producing them. In our phonetic alphabet, we pronounce P and B by putting our tongues in the same position. The only difference, P, is voiceless, whereas B, is voiced. The same goes for K, and G, G. In many old Italian dialects, the P sound got swapped for a B, and K turned into G. Because C and K had the same sound, capicola became gabagool. Grandma Hoboken and her neighbors stirred and blended English and their Italian dialects to create a new dialect, New Jersey Italian. The way I say gabagool doesn't feel like a dialect or an accent. Some people would argue it isn't. It doesn't seem weird that I'm keeping alive a mutated version of a language and culture I never experienced. It's not even a language Grandma Hoboken spoke, but it's a piece of what she carried across the Atlantic. It sounds like the dinners we had at my grandparents' house, the delis where I grabbed lunch with my dad after softball games, the restaurants we went to on special occasions. It sounds like a piece of my family, passed back and forth, twisted, changed, and shared, meal after meal. Thank you.
My name is Mary Beth Stuller, and I will be reading an excerpt from my novel in progress, Proctor. It's about a high school English teacher who ends a relationship with a teenager and tries to keep secret his mistake. I'm going to read from chapter 3. Jack, is the main character, is returning to school after summer vacation. It's the first day teachers report for duty, so there are no students in the building. Normally his wife would join him, but she's a math teacher at the same school. But she's on extended maternity leave because of postpartum depression. Chapter 3. It took Jack half an hour to get to his classroom once he entered the building. Teachers crowded the main office where Assistant Principal Mark Bannon distributed keys. Like a host, Mark greeted each member with a cheerful hello, a "How was your summer?" and a joke about last year's troublemaker. "Thank God he graduated," always preceded, "What freshman will fill his place?" Ha ha. Oh, how teaching seemed so doable with no students in sight. Jack shook hands with science teachers, tossed out "Hey, mans," and pleased himself for knowing the plays of the Orioles' rare win. Like a bee away from its hive, Jack floated down the freshly waxed hallways, past shiny yellow lockers and walls hung with new banners, their glossy letters spelling out the potential of Huntington High Hornets to keep busy. No scuff marks marred the floor, no broken pencils, crumpled papers, or forgotten calculators cluttered it. No jacket sleeves leaked out of locker doors, no homemade posters papered the stairwells. The building smelled of promise. Inside his classroom, Jack admired the naked walls and bare bulletin boards. He never layered memories year to year, but removed each displayed project, each senior portrait before he left in June. Come September, he collected and posted work and tokens anew. He liked that aspect of his job, the ability to start fresh, clean slate. When Elizabeth first started at Huntington, she floated into the room across the hall one period a day. Jack's classes would get so loud they'd draw Elizabeth's attention. "What's going on over here?" Elizabeth would ask, leaving her well-mannered students alone. The kids in her front row would lean forward, tilt their heads to see across the hall, and report play-by-play to their classmates. Once, Elizabeth found Jack's students wearing paper hats. They brandished cardboard wrapping paper rolls and jabbed each other. Jack directed from his perch on the window ledge. "Hello, Miss Bassett, may we help you?" Elizabeth indicated the warriors. "Ah, you're intrigued by our learning. It's Shakespeare. Practicing our footwork. For safety's sake, we're not using real weapons, though actors would at the Globe Theater." Elizabeth crossed her arms, her blue wrap dress tied in a bow at the waist. "You're not intrigued? We're disrupting." "I beg our pardon. I apologize if our kinesthetic learning interfered with—" "What are you studying?" He placed his finger to lip in mock contemplation. "Finding the value of X again?" She glared at him with blue eyes that invited rather than squelched him. "I take that as a no." He scratched his head. "Calculating the area of a rhombus?" She suppressed a smile. "Sorry, I'm teaching some real-life skills and not making my students beat each other with trash." "Trash?" Jack feigned horror. "I'll let you know this is a green classroom and we are reusing resources. Recycle, reduce, reuse." Jack waved his arm in a circular motion and waited for the next law in the volley. "That's quite admirable of you, but I don't see how teaching students to wear paper costumes is applicable to authentic future employment." "Aha, but it is," Jack said. He snatched a paper crown from a student and placed it on his head. "Too small, it ripped," and Jack whispered in, "Oops." He grabbed a mock sword from a startled student, cut the air with a Z, and aimed the paper tube at Elizabeth. "If you'll notice," he said, "I am wearing a paper costume, and I am gainfully employed." The class erupted in laughter. "Passion, milady, is the most important employment of all." Elizabeth shook her head and laughed lightly. "Good luck with him," she said to the class. She gestured a crazy sign beside her temple. Jack stared at her as she walked across the hall. She stopped in her doorway, faced her class, and Jack heard her students wordlessly reassemble themselves. Behind him, a student said, "She's got a nice ass." Jack spun and whacked the culprit with his false sword. Now, as Jack removed chairs from desks and dragged them into rows facing his board, he considered how much they'd been through since then, how people could change so much. Thank you.
I just want to remind everyone to talk very close to the mic because otherwise it's creating an echo for our Zoom audience. So just to readers, just remember.
Hi, good evening. My name is Raquel Gomes, and I'll be reading from my memoir about motherhood and grief. My daughter Gabby was 14 when she died of complications from a rare connective tissue disorder called Loeys-Dietz syndrome. Interesting note, Dr. Hal Dietz from Loeys-Dietz happens to be based here at Hopkins. Gabby had her second open heart surgery at 12. Unlike her first heart surgery at age 4, she was now mature enough to understand the minutiae of the procedure. So if they're stopping my heart during the operation, she asked one day at bedtime, does that mean that I'm not alive? Part of it? I was sitting at my usual spot at the edge of her bed, caressing her over the covers. No, meu amor, of course you'll be alive, I said, trying to sound confident in my answer, my chest tightening. You'll be using what's called a bypass, a pump that keeps your blood flowing through your body, acting as if it were your heart. Ever the planner, Gabby thought through her stay at Hopkins. She suggested we get a Beanie Baby keychain, one of those little stuffed animals with big sparkly eyes that she could hang on her IV pole, something nice to look at. She packed her iPad, a few favorite books, her trendy mismatching fluffy socks. Surgery went as smoothly as possible. We breathed again. That summer, Gabby was strong enough for us to go on our annual mother-daughter trip. She chose New York City. We had over the years explored Manhattan, from Ellis Island to Central Park, the New York Public Library main building, the Met, the Guggenheim, the Frick, and the Whitney. This time, with photos of New York City with kids and her iPad in hand, Gabby envisioned our itinerary herself, leading us to new sites in the big city. Dylan's Candy Bar, Max Brenner Chocolate Restaurant, Coney Island with an original Nathan's hot dog, of course, Ellen's Stardust Diner, Matilda and Wicked on Broadway. My one addition was a visit to the Tenement Museum. Strolling through Union Square on our way to Max Brenner for dinner, we suddenly paused. A gentleman played the saxophone. A group of teens played double dutch. Dozens of demonstrators gathered, protesting the shooting of Michael Brown of Ferguson, Missouri. In the midst of it all, there sat a man in his late 50s, with scruffy hair, wearing jeans and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, sitting on a stool in front of a small table with a Corona typewriter and a sign. Poems about anyone or anything. Brilliant. We stepped up as he greeted us with a smile. Hi there, interested in a poem? Go for it, love, I said to Gabby, her eyes beaming. You're visiting the city with your mom, he asked as they started chatting. I stepped back, seeing how Gabby was practically whispering to him, obviously not wanting me to hear. Moments later, the poet put his head down and typed away. By then, hundreds of demonstrators had gathered, shouting, hands up, don't shoot, hands up, don't shoot, raising their arms in the air. The poet continued typing until suddenly the crowd swarmed around us as they marched from the square to the street. Hands up, don't shoot, hands up, don't shoot. Gabby and I inched toward the poet, who stood up clutching his stool, the three of us huddling like swallows against a gust of wind. The demonstrators marched off. The poet settled back down, and after a few lingering clickety-clacks, he pulled the page from the roller and handed it to Gabby. Quiet time in the city, he called it. Its closing lines. There is nothing better than getting away from it all, right in the middle of it all. But quiet time with mom is the best thing of all. 6 months later, we were back at Hopkins. One of the wires doctors had used to fuse Gabby's sternum had broken, an edge about to pierce her translucent skin. A relatively minor procedure, but because of its location, requiring general anesthesia and the OR routine yet again. Recovering at Hopkins, Gabby worried about missing the rehearsals for the school musical, which was Annie that year. She'd be playing the role of the police officer who catches Annie when she sneaks out of the orphanage. Mine, what if I miss the dress rehearsal? You have to be at rehearsal, you know. Love, I said, I'm sure Mr. Crimmins will welcome you right back and review your lines and timing. Inside, I hoped she'd simply be discharged in time for the show. Indeed, we went home one day, and the next afternoon, Gabby was up on stage in the school auditorium, dressed up in blue slacks and a white shirt, with the police officer's cap over her hair and a billy club in hand, trailing Annie. Those back-to-back surgeries left their toll. I've never been able to run again like I used to, even just at recess, like running out to hang out by the jungle gym. She said one day as we were having our usual chat before bedtime, me sitting at the edge of her bed caressing her hair. I'm so sorry you have to go through all this, I said. How I wish I had that magic wand. The magic wand we sometimes allude to that we use to whisk those things away.
Hello, my name is Melissa Pascal, and I'll be reading from my memoir, Two Autumns. This scene takes place in a town called Greymouth, which is in New Zealand. Anne and I were dining on the hostel's free cream of mushroom soup when a pair of new arrivals, Jason and Chris from Canada, joined us in the common room. Jason suggested we go find a bar. By now, I knew Greymouth's two personas, mostly dead and really dead. During the day, there were a handful of cars, few pedestrians. Occasionally, you'd go to cross the street and have to wait for a car to pass first, marveling at the odds that you, the sole pedestrian, and the car, the sole vehicle, would cross paths so closely. At night, both vanished. But since I would look like a killjoy if I said all that, in the drizzly evening air, we sought the town's after-hours scene. There's got to be something up here, Jason said, leading the four of us up the town's main artery, a smattering of shops and cafes. Passing dark windows and closed doors, we stopped at Monteith's Brewery, the first place with the novelty of lights. Tentatively, we stepped inside and found a lone bartender with one guest. Look at the crowd, Anne said, as we scanned the expansive bar and restaurant area, a space made loftier by its barren seats. Well, we're lucky we got a table. I'll hold it while you guys get your drinks. Anne was hitchhiking, and I imagined that her sense of humor made her a fun passenger. Over our first round, she told us that she'd come to New Zealand from Ireland via Singapore, where she'd been doing contract work for the UN. After landing in Wellington and taking the ferry to the South Island, she'd hitchhiked through Nelson in the Northwest down to Greymouth. So what's it like hitchhiking here? Jason asked. Not bad, Anne said. I mean, it's not like I've got a fucking fridge with me. Some guy in Ireland did that. I made a note in my phone to look this up later while Jason asked, what made you want to stop in Greymouth, or was this just where your ride dropped you? Well, I went to the tour sport in Wellington, and I looked at a map, and I saw the name Greymouth, and I said, I want to go there. And the tour sport lady was all, nobody goes to Greymouth. And I said, nope, that's the place. It's kind of cool, Jason said, eyes shining. It has an old-timey feel. I fucking love Greymouth, Anne said. I did the pedestrian walkway today. It looks like something your mom would build, you know? Oh, you want a ham sandwich? Okay, here's ham, here's bread, have at it. Now you want someone to make you a nice touristy walkway along the river and out to the lighthouse? Here's a chunk of concrete, enjoy. With the warm lights of the empty bar spilling over my companions' faces, the soft tap of rain mingling with our prattle, I gave Greymouth some credit. Had it been a more intriguing place, I probably wouldn't have been out for drinks. Jason, Chris, and Anne would have rallied a crew from a lively hostel, and I would have escaped undetected. A few drinks later, either Chris or Jason said, "Did I tell you we saw one of those little blue penguins on the way here?" "In the wild?" I probably asked. Little blue penguins were single kilogram waddlers sporting navy suits. I'd seen them at the zoo in Wellington, and after the Kia birds in Arthur's Pass, I had dreams of stumbling across all kinds of birds in their natural environment, the wild. "Yeah, we got a picture too. Here, I'll show you." I think it was Jason who stood up and dug around in his pockets, pulling out a rectangular point and shoot and holding it aloft for Anne and me to examine. The grinning faces of Chris and Jason loomed in the frame, while behind them, a little navy hump lay wilted on the dark pavement. Is that a selfie?" Anne asked, "with a dead penguin on the side of the road?" Yeah, it is," Jason said, beaming, "but we saw one." Because little blue penguins could burrow as far as 1.5 kilometers inland, they were sometimes struck by cars on seaside roads. Jason and Chris's photo could seem callous, but I couldn't deny the truth of it. After all, there was no point in avoiding what a bird's wild existence was really like in New Zealand. In the photos I'd taken at the zoo, I'd cropped out much of the background, the fence surrounding the enclosure, the people leaning on it, so that the only things in the frame had been the little blue penguin and the muddy water. In Arthur's Pass, there'd been no way to eliminate Wayne's roof from my photos of the Kia birds, and suddenly that context seemed to be important instead of superfluous. To not isolate beings and create the illusion of buffer space where it did not actually exist. To widen the shot and our concept of what made an authentic one. In lulls between our conversations, silence bounced around the tall ceiling. Gray Mouth still seemed to be nothing but extra space. It was not an adventurous backpacker's natural environment, and at the time I thought I'd simply crop it out of my memory. "Well, I'm going to use the toilet," Anne said later. Glancing around, she added, "Save my seat." Thank you.
Hi, this is Drew Crowder reading the opening to Skyfire, a novel. Bright skies and crisp air permeate the lush landscape of Torrenfall, realm of the rain dancers. Balthazar, an elder dragon, sits atop a gentle lakeside waterfall looking skyward. The wind shifts as a formation of young dragons burst through a patch of clouds and begin a series of barrel rolls around each other, headed toward the palace. Focused on a target in the distance, their riders tuck closely to their saddles. Sunlight reflects from their ornately designed armor and cascades in a hypnotic pattern on the ground while they gain speed. Each revolution spins faster than the next. The flight pattern begins to shift. The spiral expands and contracts like a heartbeat. Blue light sparks in the eyes and hearts of both dragon and rider and spreads throughout their bodies. "This is my favorite part," Moloch says, emerging from behind Balthazar. "Come on, let's get a closer look for the big finish." Balthazar lowers his body for Moloch to mount his saddle. "Well," he continues, "aren't you coming?" He turns to look back behind his mount. His daughter, Sasha, a young brown-haired girl, sits patiently on a boulder. She stops watching the fanfare above, from between the dragon's wings, for a moment, to consider his request. She leaps to her feet and runs around the dragon's belly, to the side where Moloch sits, his hand outstretched. He places her in front of him in the saddle, strapping her in tightly. "Too tight," she says. "Daddy, it's too tight. My legs are gonna fall off." "You'll be fine, sweetie," he says. The water around them ripples when they launch. Balthazar dips toward the ground, and with 2 flaps of his wings the ascent begins. They climb to the sky, the dragons in front of them blurring with speed and intensity. "Here we go," Sasha whispers, gripping the reins tightly. The dragons break formation all at once. In their wake, a rippling current of water circles around itself like overlapping braids. The water collides with the floating target, exploding it on impact. Blue sparks fly. Below, the gathered crowd cheers. Nailed it, Moloch says. You know, sweetie, I taught them that. I know, Daddy. You taught them everything. That's why you're the high cleric, she says. Balthazar glides through the air toward the crowd. Moloch and Sasha wave, landing in a small garden. They dismount and walk toward an opening where the ballerinas are carved into white stone pillars encircling a round fountain. At the center, a giant pearl spins perpetually on a cloud of water. Smaller pools of water sit still around the larger sculptures. Why are there no fountains in these ones, Daddy? Sasha says. Those are called practice circles, Sasha, Moloch says. There are very few rain dancer clerics who can summon water from the air. Most of them can only manipulate it. Oh, Sasha says, bending down to stare at her reflection in one of the pools. She waves. Her reflection waves back as they both giggle with delight. She repeats the motion, this time more deliberately. The water level in the circle begins to rise and take the shape of a ballet dancer, swaying and jumping. Sasha's eyes widen, watching the figure twirl across the water's edge. I'm doing it, she says. I'm a cleric. Look at me, I can do magic. Moloch, approaching middle age with his dark hair, scruffy beard, and athletic build, stands behind her. His eyes and tribal markings on his arms glow electric blue. His hands move as if he's conducting music. He pushes the water with delicate flicks of his fingers. He closes his hands. The light disappears from his body, and the ballerina falls into the water. Did you see me? Sasha turns and runs to Moloch. He sweeps her off her feet and embraces her. Did you see me? I made the water dance, and I'm only 9. I did, sweetheart. You were great, he says. He sets her down and kneels beside her. Now, where is your mother? She's at the sanctuary getting Balthazar a new saddle. She glances over to her father's dragon. Balthazar, seeing her attention, lifts his head from the fountain. He sprays a tiny stream of water in their direction from his mouth and turns back to the fountain to resume his hydration. Why do dragons wear saddles? Sasha says. Because, sweetheart. Otherwise, we can't ride them. He picks her up again and places her on his shoulders. If we just sat on their shoulders without a saddle, we'd flop around like this. Sasha holds her father's outstretched hands, giggling uncontrollably while he bounces around the fountain. Her face slowly falls while he stops and sets her on the ground. She folds her arms and looks up at him. Papa has to go now. It's time for the ceremony.
Okay, thank you, Drew, on the screen there. Our next group of readers will begin with Kara Kinnaman, reading from her fiction. Following Kara, we have Tiffany James, reading from her nonfiction manuscript, followed by one more fiction reader, Hannah Sahajlichya. And after Hannah, we will have both Smalka reading nonfiction. And then our last reader in the second group is Liza Jane, and you have seen Liza on the screen earlier this evening, and she'll be reading live, not recorded, from Atlanta. So let's welcome Kara.
Hello, I'm Kara Kinnaman. I'm going to read chapter 1 of my novel in progress titled Burn Down the Moon, starting on page 3. Owen entered the apartment with his work bag slung over one shoulder and his gym bag over the other. Levi danced at his feet. His little marbled tail swung like a metronome, keeping time. Get back. Owen was in a mood. Gemma scooped up Levi and reached for a bag with her free hand. Wine's on the table. She dropped his gym bag on the washing machine and set Levi on the couch before circling back to the kitchen. She grabbed her own glass and leaned in for a kiss. Owen quickly returned the gesture. Bad day? Just long. He sounded like he needed to eat. Dinner's almost ready. He side-eyed the stove as he washed out his to-go coffee mug at the sink. He returned to his task tight-lipped. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind. I made a new salad to try. Goody. She released her grip and stepped back. What's wrong? He finished rinsing the mug, wiped it dry, and returned it to the cabinet without a word. Gemma kept her eyes on him. She sipped from her wine glass, preparing to ask again, when he broke the silence. I can't do this anymore. I know, she sighed. I'm getting tired of it too. After tonight, I'll only make the spaghetti once a month. It's just, no, not the spaghetti. He leaned back against the kitchen counter and looked at his feet. This. A knot tightened in Gemma's throat. She tried to swallow, but it only grew thicker. Owen lifted his head with what seemed like morbid curiosity, the way you peer at a widow on the big day. She almost laughed at that uncomfortable, you can't be serious way. His eyes shined with each blink before returning downward, and that's when she knew. He wanted out. And just like that, their relationship and the world they shared broke. 7 years down the drain, the majority of her 20s, living in sin, as her mama would say. Her first thought was no, like he needed her permission to break up with her. And then it hit her. He was dumping her just a month shy of her 30th birthday. The controversial, pressurized big 3-0, an age she had planned to embrace with her cushy job, fiancé, and carefully curated wardrobe all set in place. Now that birthday loomed in front of her like a cliff. Where she was from, a single woman turning 30 equated shame, failure, and she had worked diligently to prove herself anything but a failure since she left. He was bucking the hourglass, caving under the invisible ultimatum, and she realized nothing she'd built was safe from collapse. Her dad's lightning-quick heart attack had been absolute. There was no negotiation. But this she could fight. She could outrun a tornado. I don't understand. A tear dribbled down his face. She wanted to wipe it away with a knife. We aren't us anymore. Something's different. Different how? I need specifics, Owen. You can't just make the decision to end us. But she knew he could. He always had been calculated and fixed in his decisions. Their couch was hunter green because it was his favorite color. I started taking the long way home from work. She stumbled back and sat in the dining room chair. She thought her ears might pop. His mind was made up. Forget love. He didn't even like her anymore. But you're my home. Her voice broke at the end and she hated herself. Hated that she'd found comfort in a person that didn't even want her. I'm sorry. She was really fucking tired of that word. Over and over again for the past 5 heartbreaking months, and she was supposed to respond to each one like it was brand new. Sorry about your dad. Sorry for your loss. I'm so sorry. It no longer held meaning. A word that fills the dead air when nothing else can be done. A word that only brings relief to the person saying it. But her world crumbling again deserved more of an explanation. The end of a 7-year relationship warranted a novel. Why? I told you, it's just different. Bullshit, her ears burned. How long? What? How long have you felt this way? I don't know. Owen, I don't know. A few weeks, maybe less. Are you cheating on me? No. She felt simultaneously relieved and suspiciously sick. Is there someone else? No, I promise. Are you not attracted to me anymore? Gemma, please. She wanted to throw her wine, glass and all, right at his chest. She downed it instead. So you don't love me. I will always love you. He said it like it was already done, like they'd already crossed the imaginary line of love and loved. Admit it. Admit what? I haven't done anything. I swear on Levi. She tilted her head back and blinked at the ceiling before speaking. You can't handle my grief. The recessed lighting seemed to flicker as her words settled between them. Her clarity operated at a deafening frequency. You seem fine. He inhaled as he spoke, as if there was no more oxygen left in the room. Fine? Just because she wasn't a blubbering mess didn't mean she was fine. The earth keeps turning, another day, another photo shoot. But she was limping through the motions, in no shape to absorb another blow. Everything she had suppressed and denied about Owen for the sake of comfort suddenly bubbled to the surface. You've shown your true colors since Dad died. I mean, for fuck's sake, you were late to the funeral. You can't take Levi to the vet by yourself, and the audacity to complain about Dad's spaghetti when you never cook. The list of good traits and memories knocked at her mind's eye. She scrunched her face and willed them away. They would only make her weak. Gemma, chill out. You have flaws too. I'm not standing here listing them. Well, maybe you should so I can understand where the fuck this is coming from. Her hands emphasized every word. I thought we were it, Owen. I half expected a proposal this Christmas Eve. Engaged by 30, remember? Except his face showed no recognition of the apparently false promise he'd shut her up with. We've been saving to buy a house. Do you understand how confusing that is? She felt her cheeks growing hot. This was ridiculous. She almost laughed, but she couldn't suppress it any longer. A reel of good times flooded her vision. Decorating the Christmas tree at their first apartment, a weed-induced sandcastle contest at the beach, him washing her hair in the tub the night after her dad died. The last 7 years of her life turned into a minefield of loaded memories. She collapsed to her knees all at once. Tears slid down her face without permission. Levi frantically ran to her side and licked her arms. He barked as Owen tried to pull her up. She shrugged off his feeble attempt and shrank into a ball of limbs and tangled hair. The apartment seemed to disappear, and she spiraled into her own black abyss of what nows? The lease, their stuff, Levi, Thanksgiving in Virginia, her birthday. Her future suddenly turned on its side, losing shape. She was single, sitting on that floor, single and starting all the way over at nearly 30. Married people bury their parents, not single ones. You weren't supposed to do it alone. Lose one family before starting another. It wasn't designed that way. Why was her life not following the design? She'd done everything she was supposed to. She'd even gone to one of the best art schools in the country. Design was her thing. Her phone timer sounded. The garlic bread was ready. She pulled herself up and shuffled over to the stove. She turned off the oven and burners. A congealed film covered the sauce. Over her shoulder, she saw Owen sitting on the couch, his weak frown illuminated by the light of his phone. Then she realized she'd have to break the news to 90,000 followers. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany James, and I'll be reading a piece from my collection of essays. I structured this narrative in a two-braided essay structure that explores two specific moments in my life. The first involves an experience that occurred when I was 27 involving a machete, and the second one involves an experience that occurred when I was 15 involving a knife. This essay is called The Machete, Knife, and Other Things That Rhyme with Snitch. Part 1. 5 days before Thanksgiving of 2013, after serving as a volunteer on a rehab project that would help a family return to their Coney Island home damaged by Hurricane Sandy, I found myself dodging a man with a machete while walking down a main street in Brooklyn. I was 27, struggling to survive on $8.75 an hour as a barista at a bookstore in the Upper East Side. On that particular Saturday, the sun loitered over West 27th Street as I turned onto Mermaid Avenue. I traveled eastward towards the subway, and the crisp air pricked my face and bare hands. Only 11 short blocks stood between me and the next Manhattan-bound train departing from the Coney Island Stillwell station. Feeling accomplished after 4 hours of volunteer work, I removed my cell phone from my pocket to call my friend Cassandra and kill time during the 16-minute walk. Looking both ways, I crossed one street after another, passing by nondescript mom-and-pop shops, delis, laundromats, and nail salons. My focus fixed on the conversation and my destination. While Cassandra recapped her morning, I noticed a large crowd congregated on the corner 3 blocks down. Maybe I should cross the street. Like a cloud, that thought floated across my mind and was gone. Unfazed by the prospect of maneuvering through a crowd, I stayed the course until I was only 1 block away from the cluster and shifted into a breaking news commentator. Uh-oh, Cassandra. Some random guy just burst through the crowd down the block and he's running towards me. I said, calm and collect. Let me move to the side so he can pass by. What? Cassandra asked, confused by the sudden topic change. Dark hair sprouted from the man's head and accentuated his blanched skin. He wore a busied expression. A partially unzipped black puffer jacket that seemed 2 sizes too big encased his upper body. His left arm pressed tight against his waist, while his right hand reached inside his coat. Cassandra? This guy just opened the front of his jacket and pulled out a machete. I said, let me cross the street. From the cell phone clutched in my hand came the words, what? What's happening? Part 2. They're at it again, my mom said, glaring at me. I was 15 at the time, and she loomed over me, pausing behind the living room couch where I sat motionless, with my fists clenched and arms crossed. She demanded a proper reaction. What? I said. The neighbors. They're coming through the fucking floor, probing me while I sleep again, and they finally got me. Darkness unapologetically clung to the edges of the room, but I didn't have to look to see my mom's oversized white tee hanging off her short and curvy frame, barefoot and bare-legged. Her hair parted off center and stretched straight by decades of hot combs and hair relaxers. Her dark spots clustered on her forehead, a burn scar. A few times when I was younger, my mom had told me the story of her scar and how during a visit at her mother's house, she bent down to remove food cooking in the oven, how flames exploded in her face upon opening the door, how her forehead endured most of the impact, as well as her long eyelashes that never entirely grew back. I stared at the television, seeing without seeing, attempting to ignore the fact that my mom had advanced towards the kitchen to sterilize a steak knife over the open flame of our gas stove. I didn't know how to respond because there were no neighbors. The elderly man from the apartment below us had died a few months prior. I had desperately hoped that my mom's fears would depart along with his body. Despite the downstairs apartment's vacancy, my mom claimed people were sneaking in to continue his unfinished work. I feel something hard in my arm, she said. They implanted a device under my skin this time. She shut off the burner, entered the living room, and motioned for me to follow. She stormed towards the bathroom of our apartment with me trailing close behind, and stopped in the hallway, lit solely by the bathroom light and 2 televisions, whispering in discord from the living room and her bedroom. She turned to face me, reaching out to hand me the knife. I scanned it, studying the stiff black handle resting in her palm, the snaggle-toothed edge of the blade, the sharp black blue tip, its burn scar. I need your help getting this thing out of my arm, she said. My mom wanted me to slice a piece of her skin off and remove an implanted device. She waited for me to take the knife, and I waited for her to come to her senses. Those seconds seemed to last forever. Disbelief blunted my thoughts. What's happening? Knife. Mom, please don't do this. Knife. Don't take the knife. If I don't take the knife, will she go through with it? What should I do? Called 911? Who calls 911 on their mom? I thought of her greatest hits for whenever I failed to act the way she wanted. I sacrificed so much for you, she'd say. You're always putting my business out on the street, even when you were a child, she'd say. Why is it so easy for you to betray me when all I do is love you? I heard these remarks whenever she accused me of being a snitch. I could never recall any specific memories that supported her accusations. Can you really be a snitch when there's no one around to inform? Thank you.
Good evening all. My name is Hannah Sagidachna, and I will be reading the first chapter of the novel in progress, Bright Flowers. And before I start reading it, I would like to thank my mother, who provided me with a lively childhood full of books. I would like to thank my boyfriend, who has been very supportive of my writing, and all my friends for their encouragement. And I also would like to thank all my professors who contributed to my development as a writer throughout the program. In the light of scarlet sunrise beams, Khan stumbled over a dead cow, its abdomen cut open with a straight line from the throat down to the bottom. Tutu, he said quietly. Crimson rays pierced the barn through thin holes in the wood walls, lighting the dead animal. Khan's head was spinning. My friend, he sighed. Now, more saddened than angered, Khan stepped back outside to gasp for air. It was a cloudless, quiet day. The trees rose above the field grass in the distance like giants. I cannot confess to anyone but Tutu what I am to do now. As Khan watched the hawks flying over the barn, he recalled the story he had shared with Tutu in the fields. The first time he had felt a desire to kiss his younger brother happened on a July night 3 months ago. Khan had been unable to fall asleep. After playing with his butterfly knife in the moonlight, he became bored. The boy moved toward his brother's bed like a ghost. Erden was 14, 2 years younger than Khan. He occupied the lower level of the bunk bed. Erden's arms were twisted around his head, his mouth closed but legs open, his whole body uncovered. Khan smelled pines, perspiration, and fresh milk. Erden's face was motionless, a doll's face with wide veins pulsating from his forehead down the temples, cheeks, and neck. When Erden moaned, Khan held his breath. His brother's lips looked plump and wet. Khan's neck became stiff. There was no air to breathe. Khan rushed back to his bed, his body shaking. As misery prevailed, shame arose. He feared not only the Orthodox God seeing him there, but Erden too. The ugly truth was that Khan had never kissed anyone but his mother's cheeks before. Torn with this memory and Tutu's death, Khan returned to the barn. Khan sat next to the breathless but still warm animal. He sweated from head to toe. After taking off his vest, he threw it over a wooden bulkhead. Who? Khan fell to his knees, choking with viscous saliva. Will I speak to now? Other cows stood at the other side of the barn, blowing hot steam from their nostrils. The animals stacked close to one another, staring at Khan and moving from time to time. Tutu lay next to the hay pile like a seashell washed up to shore. While circling around Tutu, Khan noticed a tiny piece of paper and picked it up. Drying his eyes, the boy shoved the paper scrap into his vest pocket without noticing the thin marks on it. Unlike his father's, Khan's vest had an imprint of 3 snakes intertwined among one another with their tongues out. After praying for 10 minutes, forehead down to knees, both palms on the animal's breast, Khan glanced askew at the innocent creature, stood up, and left the barn. Khan walked straight down the hill toward the shaman's hut, passing by his family house. It was a one-story house made of brick and distanced from the rest of the village in the northern Siberian taiga. Maples and elms, oaks and willows, spruces and pines encircled the house with shutters on the 6 windows. A small pond sat behind the house on the other side of the barn. The front door, as well as the furniture and cutlery inside, had the images of hunters and trees, bears and hawks, bows and arrows, all sacred elements of Tungusic culture. The 4 most prosperous Tungusic tribes in the village each had a canoe, and each canoe bore its tribe's totemic emblem. Khan's family belonged to the 4th group, and as a totemic animal had reindeer. His family's guns and knives probably had deer heads engraved on them, with the radiant beams coming out. Wolves, bears, and owls were the totems of the other 3 tribes. The last time Khan visited Shaman was when the snow had melted this year. Today, as with previous visits, was all about faith. Shaman's hut was hidden in the heart of the forest, on the other side of the Amur River. While some sought Shaman's guidance, others ignored his powers, but everyone feared him. His dwelling was a place one would never want to venture on his own. Khan, however, overcame his reluctance and fear, now motivated by his need to see justice for the death of Tutu, his confidant and friend. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Bo Smolka. Before I read, I'm not going to let this moment pass without saying some proper thanks to people. I think it's very, very important to me that people in this room hear this from me. Beginning with Karen and Ed Perlman and Alex Beats, faculty I worked with in this program. Karen and I had 4 or 5 classes, and the thing I take away from this program more than anything else is creative risk-taking. It was encouraged by Karen at every turn. And when my work worked in this program, it worked because I took creative risks. And I'm deeply indebted to the faculty here for doing that. And any of the students that are still in the program thinking, should I try that? I don't know, will that work? You absolutely should try it. And I would say there's no better venue in which to try it. Take creative risks. I also absolutely need to thank the group we know as Montana Plus. This is my cohort here at Hopkins. Many have graduated, a few are with me here tonight and reading. A lot of us did the Montana Intensive together a few years ago, and they have become the writing community I longed for when I joined this program. We get together about every 8 weeks and we workshop each other's work. We share tips, we share ideas, we share laughs, we share frustrations, we share successes, and quite frankly, they're the best people I've met in my 20+ years living in Baltimore. And they are without question the best thing that happened to me in this program. And finally, I need to thank my family, my wife, Jeannie, my daughter Katie is here, my son Matt is in college at Notre Dame. Their support through this whole thing has been very, very valuable, all 5 years it took me to finish. My thesis, my children more than anything else, unwittingly or not, are subjects in my thesis. My thesis is called Arrivals and Departures, Essays on Family and Fatherhood. And I'm reading tonight one of those essays. It's called Sail Away. My teenage son, Matt, watches me hopscotch Legos scattered across the basement carpet and shoehorn a puzzle into a cabinet crammed with art kits. The coronavirus pandemic has given us plenty of time to look around the house, watch out for Legos, assess the changing state of our lives, and realize we just have too much stuff. As Matt spies the army man at the bottom of a cabinet, dutifully obeying stay-at-home orders, he utters a thought that hits me like a ton of building blocks. We should have a garage sale. Ah, the garage sale, that all-American rite of summer where materialism, capitalism, and kitsch collide, where one person's trash is another's treasure, treasure being something you can negotiate down to $1.25. I know Marie Kondo, whose passion for decluttering took Netflix by storm, but I did hold a garage sale years ago. I was about to get married, and as any married man knows, once the ring happens, her stuff becomes our stuff, and your stuff becomes gone. My main objective at that sale was to unload a pair of couches, and I arranged the merchandise so prospective buyers couldn't see a hole that a mouse had chewed in the back of one of them. I got that tip from a friend who often borrowed my pickup truck for garage sales, just in case he bought something large, such as a couch without a mouse hole in the back. He would take my truck, and I would take his car, which happened to be a royal blue Mazda Miata convertible. I always had more errands to run when I had the keys to a royal blue Mazda Miata convertible. This time around, we don't have couches to sell, but we do have stuffed animals. Over the course of 2 decades, my children, now 18 and 13, have accumulated stuffed otters and dinosaurs and lions and tigers and bears, oh my. The next time we have a flood, forget the sandbags. We can line the house with Beanie Babies. I'm already imagining a discussion I'll have with my daughter Katie about culling this herd, yet I don't exactly have a paw to stand on. I still own a stuffed bear I got on my first birthday. We also have cars. There's no royal blue Mazda Miata convertible, but we have a Corvette, a Mustang, and about 50 other Matchbox cars. There's a little wear on the tire, but they still handle well. And of course we have Army men, no longer performing maneuvers in the living room or mounting a beach offensive in the sandbox. They are encamped at the bottom of the cabinet. They need a new captain. Then there are the books. These are not the books in the kids' bedroom or the living room, the ones we read often or want guests to think we read often. These are the books that sometime before our last move, we boxed up because I insisted on keeping them. In the past 8 years, they have moved exactly 0 inches. As I contemplate unloading these books, I already know how this will go. I will open a box of books, pick one out, and 4 hours later, dinner will be ready. In a time of so much uncertainty and so few social opportunities, it's comforting to sit down with an old friend, even when it's a character in a book. I know it's past time for this house cleaning, but parting is such sweet sorrow. I ate when I packed up baby clothes or shoes the kids had outgrown. When I see that bin full of cars, I see a toddler's hands racing them around the family room, the sound of a motor sputtering from little lips. Now that toddler is driving his own car. Those Matchbox cars travel miles I can't get back. Can I just keep 2 or 6 or 10? Indeed, this garage sale business involves some tough decisions. I envision my family sitting down like an ancient tribunal, prepared to render thumbs up or thumbs down verdict as toys and games are called to judgment on the ping pong table. Definitely not for sale. I expect intense UN-type negotiations, and I wonder what the kids will say if I propose veto power. Certain things are off limits though. We aren't selling the doll crib my brother made or the kids' stove I built for Katie. They could end up under the next generation's Christmas tree. We have considered holding a garage sale before, but for the past decade, we have been held captive on weekends by another slice of Americana, youth sports. Soccer season merged into basketball season, merged into baseball or softball season. My wife and I spent our weekends shuffling 2 kids to 3 fields for 4 games in a car that is about as far as you can get from a royal blue Mazda Miata convertible. But Matt goes to college this fall, and Katie's games are on Sundays. The Saturday calendar is suddenly as blank as the whiteboard easel that, yes, will be for sale. It's as if the earth has shifted on its axis. Whenever this pandemic subsides, and we can safely have people in our driveway again, we'll be ready to dust off sports gear, bring Army men out of retirement, and give that Matchbox Corvette another spin. There's something macabre, though, about seeing strangers hover like vultures over your prized possessions. Okay, prized possessions might be stretching it when talking about a salt shaker painted like a rabbit. But these are your things, and they've been your things for a long time, and then suddenly they're no longer your things. Making matters worse, some customers will balk at a $1 price tag. Wait, you want the Corvette and the Mustang for $0.25? Making matters better, we'll have donuts. As we plan our garage sale and prepare to build farewell to games and toys and sports cleats, I can practically see the empty nest from here. On the one hand, it gives me great pangs of longing. On the other hand, at least there will be room for more books. Thank you.
Liza, can you hear us?
I can.
Would you like it to hear you?
Are you ready for me? Great. All right. I'm Liza Jane, and this is an excerpt from my novel, Sparks to Ashes. As Riley reached the clearing, she sighed with relief that Kirk was not standing there waiting. She walked under the laundry lines. As long as it didn't rain, the diapers would be dry before nightfall. Jarek was sleeping peacefully in his sling. For once, the birds were quiet, so maybe he'd sleep a little longer. Riley's pulse thumped in her ears. It was so quiet. Whoomp, whoomp. Her heart beat faster, trying to match the pulse in her ears, and every hair on her arms lifted like she'd rubbed them with a balloon. Cold dread dropped into Riley's gut and stuck there. That sound was not her heartbeat. Whoomp, whoomp. The sound came with pressure, squeezing and releasing her whole body like a heart monitor cuff at the drugstore. It was hard to breathe. It was hard to think. Whoomp, whoomp. Something crunched in the forest. Riley froze and scanned the tree line looking for any movement. A branch broke to the left of the trail, and there it was. A spark. Riley hadn't seen one since the city, and even then it had been so chaotic that it was hard to tell who had turned and who was just screaming. This one was dirty. It must have been in the woods a long time. Riley held out hope that it was just a normal human in filthy clothes until the electric pulses that gave the monsters their name glowed eerily against the shadow of the woods. Whoomp, whoomp. Unmistakable, undeniable. The blue lines of electricity rippled out from its chest and through its fingers in sick, unnatural strobes. Months of hiding in the woods in this moment still felt unavoidable. A grim guarantee. The thing clawed at a tree, tearing the bark piece by piece with fingers and teeth made recklessly strong by vacant hunger. It gnawed around the trunk, following a line of something too small to see, gouging chunks out of the soft wood beneath the bark. Riley stood frozen as she watched, hoping her stillness granted invisibility. The bottles of water around her neck pulled her down, and she wished the world would open up and swallow her and Jarek just for a minute. Just hide them until the spark went away or died, or whatever sparks did once they finished eating. She had to move. Riley slowly set down the water jugs, then lifted the rope with the bottles off her neck, careful not to let them bump into each other. The spark hadn't noticed them yet, and she had to keep it that way. She unhooked the sling holding the sleeping baby and gently laid him into the bassinet. His head lolled peacefully, and he stayed fast asleep. She stood and reached behind her for the rifle. Her hand touched nothing. She realized her mistake. She turned and looked at the Bronco with the rifle resting against the side where she'd set it before changing Jarek's diaper. In her hurry to finish her chores, she'd forgotten it. Blood rushed behind her eyes and into her ears as her mind went numb with the frantic debate over what to do, producing no good options. The pulse emitting from the spark continued relentlessly, deafening and maddening. Whoomp, whoomp. If she picked up the baby, she risked waking him. One noise and that thing would break every bone in its body trying to get to them. There was no way she'd have time to run to the gun, put the baby down and fire. It was way too fast for that. And what if she missed? She was a decent shot, but not perfect, and these things had to be shot through the heart. She glared at the spark and wished Kirk would suddenly appear and kill the thing for her. I mean, that was his job, wasn't it? Why he always kept watch? She got the water and took care of Jarek. He protected them from monsters. She glanced at her beautiful, sleeping infant. Moving him was too risky, and she couldn't wait any longer. She had to leave him to get the gun. Decision made, she took a step backwards, then another. then another. Her heart pounded against her ribs so hard she could swear it was audible, though with the blood screaming in her ears and the ever-present pulsing, she couldn't say for certain. Her hands felt like sticks of unused Play-Doh, and doubt trickled into her mind as sweat trickled into her palms. A few more steps, then a few more, each one taking her closer to her weapon, but farther from her baby. She hazarded a glance back at the car. She was nearly there. She took a larger step backwards and immediately paid for her haste. Her foot caught a rock and she fell hard. An involuntary grunt escaped as her back hit the ground with a bruise-worthy thud. Even if the wind hadn't been knocked out of her, she wouldn't have been able to breathe as she gaped at the spark. Whoomp, whoomp. It continued to chew on the tree, oblivious to her existence. The brief relief hadn't settled even a moment when a shriek pierced the quiet. Riley's heart plunged into her gut as she heard Jarek wail. His little hand reached up out of the bassinet, wanting mommy. The spark looked at the noise almost curiously, then with impossible speed tore across the clearing at a screaming baby. Whoomp, 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 whoomp. Riley bolted up and sprinted the final yards to the car. Fear locked into every muscle in her body, stealing her grace and dexterity and leaving nothing but thick feet and heavy legs. She had to run faster. Her blood burned even as her skin froze. Tears poured from her eyes in panic, and she tasted blood where she must have bit into her cheek. She lunged for the rifle, frantically turning and locking it into her shoulder. The spark was at the laundry line's mouth agape and growling. Its eyes glowed brighter than the sun glinting off its bald head, thick blue lines pulsing across its skull and neck. Whoomp, 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 whoomp. Riley wiped the dirt and tears from her eyes, took aim and squeezed the trigger. Click. She forgot the safety. Screaming in frustration, she flicked the switch to red and brought the gun back to her shoulder. Jarek's cries reached a fever pitch as the monster ran through the fire toward him, its jaw pulled into a natural rictus, revealing blue sparks bubbling in its throat. Riley inhaled and fired. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliza.
Amanda Barrett, reading from nonfiction, will be our first leader in our final group. And following Amanda, we have Joyce Hesselberg. And reading fiction, Megan Bontrager will also be reading fiction via a recording. Megan is in Ireland. And our last reader this evening is Cheyenne Leonardo, reading from her nonfiction. So let's welcome Amanda Barrett. For those of you who are with us on Zoom, we're now getting our wonderful technician up here to achieve what Karen and I think.
There we are. All right.
Thank you.
Yes. Hey, folks. I'm Amanda Barrett, and I'll be reading from the first chapter of my thesis, a memoir about living in the wake of loss. This chapter is called Grave Departures. In it, I argue that the stages of grief model does not actually reflect how we grieve. It also limits the ways we write about death. I provide some new ways to think about both. This chapter begins and ends with a story. Tonight, I will tell you that story. Grave departures. The conference room in the ICU was jammed with empty chairs. The clearing at the top of the table left just enough space for me and a young palliative care doctor. In front of him lay the crisp pages of the advanced medical directive for my brother Scott, who was dozing in a nearby room an oxygen mask digging purple marks into his flushed face. Scott had pneumonia. The doctor pointed to a paragraph. This is where we are now, and it says here he doesn't want to be treated. I looked at the paragraph where he pointed, and even though I had helped Scott prepare the document, the words were incomprehensible. A block of text hovering above the page. The doctor told me that the medical directive speaks for patients when they can't speak for themselves. But I knew that whatever Scott signed in the past, he would never give up now. He believed he would walk again, even though he hadn't taken a step in 20 years. The doctor said he's quadriplegic.
Be a little closer. Sorry.
How much closer could I be?
I don't know, but some folks in the back can't hear. Sorry.
Back there? All right. I'm gonna keep going. We're in the ICU. It's a little tense. Okay, the doctor said he's quadriplegic. Actually, I thought, he can lift his right arm. He doesn't know where he is. Well, that's just because he's disoriented from pneumonia. If we take him off oxygen now, and he somehow manages to get better, he'll be back here in under 6 months with the same thing. The doctor explained that he had patients with terminal diseases in excruciating pain who told him they were absolutely ready to die. But when he said, "How about today?" they replied, "Oh, not today." I laughed. They had a lot on their plate today. Things to do, people to see. Even people who are ready to die are not ready to die. Scott would be the last member of my family to die. My husband, my father, my mother, and my sister were all dead. And I was not ready. Scott's oxygen couldn't just be turned off. A doctor needed to approve it, and apparently he was busy with patients who were trying to stay alive. I wanted to get everything over with, hopefully before dinner. The M&Ms have run out. My cousin Brian wanted me to hold everything until his sister Brianna and her fiance arrived. They were driving from North Carolina, where she was doing a medical residency. In the hallway, as his mom was on the phone with Brianna, Brian insisted we needed to wait. I said it wasn't about her. It was about me, but I didn't say that. When Ryan protested, I shouted, "Fuck you," into his face, and he yelled, "Fuck you," back. The doctor was still nowhere to be found, and Brianna finally arrived. We ate Chinese food as Scott napped. As the afternoon dragged on, I went to Scott's bed and sat next to him. He was still attached to the oxygen mask, the tube tethering him to the wall. The pulse ox monitor on his finger glowed. I didn't want him to struggle to speak, so I just looked into his tired eyes, dulled and ringed with red. He seemed like he was about to cry, and so was I. So I hitched myself closer and rested my head on his chest. The commotion in the room receded. His body was warm beneath the thin hospital gown, and though there was always a part of me that pushed Scott away, I allowed myself to relax into him. His breath whooshed in and out in gentle waves, and soon my breath slowed to his rhythm. Later, the doctor would come, and Scott would exhale for the last time. And I would return home to plan his funeral. But for now, we were alone together on a small boat, floating on a becalmed sea. When I finally lifted my head, our cousins were standing in a circle surrounding the two of us in the bed, silent, holding hands. Tears still in my eyes, I smiled and stepped into the circle.
evening. I'm Joyce Hesselberg, and I'll be reading an excerpt from my book, which is a book for children ages 8 to 12, titled Swamp Girl. I'm an illustrator, so I thought I'd show you also what my main characters look like. That's Marjorie over on the left side of the screen. And I'll give you a brief synopsis to catch you up to date where we are in the story. 10-year-old Marjorie is a budding naturalist who lives at the edge of the Everglades. Now, her one big dream is to find a new species of something, anything, but most likely an insect, because there are millions of insects in the world that are yet to be discovered. One day, while following a magnificent winged creature down a path, Marjorie gets lost. She yells for help, but no one comes, or so she thinks. But actually, a large swamp amphibian is watching closely. His name is Roger. That's Roger over on the right side, he's a big green guy. Roger loves his home dearly. As humans have developed the land around him, he has remained hidden and he tries to protect the swamp. As Marjorie tries to formulate a plan, a mosquito tickles her leg. She swats it and flicks it to the ground, dead. Roger is furious that anyone would hurt a defenseless mosquito. He leaps into the air to attack. Marjorie runs for her life and narrowly escapes. Roger falls to the ground with an ungraceful splat. So the chapter that I'm reading, Roger considers his next move.
We want to stop the share. Oh, you want to? It's not being shared right now. So, yeah, it's shared on your. We good? Okay. So you want to stop?
Chapter 7. Roger needed to get the girl out of his swamp, preferably back to the human side. He'd seen their side before. Once, when he was just a speck of a thing, practically a tadpole, his uncle had taken him to the very edge. Never go past this line, Uncle had warned, pointing at the place where vine-covered trees were met with a field of perfectly mown grass. Through the leafy branches, Roger remembered seeing brightly colored boxes of pink and yellow that the humans would go in and out of. Houses, Uncle called them. They had names for other things too. Automobiles and swing sets and bicycles, so many things. They had funny little animals with wagging tails that followed after them. But the most amazing things were the people themselves. He had wondered how they survived with their tender skin and tiny teeth. They barely had claws at all. Why can't we go over there, Uncle? Roger had asked. That world is for humans. This world is ours. That was a long time ago. Uncle had died soon after. Well, not exactly died. He just hadn't come back. When the weather warmed up that spring, Roger awoke to discover giant machines that dug up their perfectly pleasant mangrove shelter. There was nothing left but cold, hard pavement. He tunneled up to the surface, barely able to find his way around sharp objects that pierced the land. He looked everywhere for some sign that Uncle was hiding under the surface. Maybe he was just playing a game. But Uncle never came back. Roger had been on his own ever since. Sure, lots of other creatures kept him company. Alligators, crocodiles, every bird you can imagine. Frogs, fish, snails, and the most delightful bugs. But he was the only one of him. The only Roger. He slumped to the ground. In his less than graceful fall, he landed on his side. He gently rubbed the sore spots. That will leave a nasty bruise, he thought. The girl had bolted. He never knew humans could run that fast. Or run at all, actually. The ones he had seen in the past were mostly bigger and slower, the exceptions being those who rode vessels on top of the river. The vessels were sharp and loud. They crashed through the water in a most unpleasant way. Those humans moved quickly, but not on her legs. Roger was worried that if he didn't get the girl out of the swamp, she would do even more damage. The swamp has very few rules, but generally speaking, flattening other creatures is not allowed, not without a reason. Defending the territory, attack away. Every creature needs a place to live. Protecting family, without question, family is important. Hungry, totally appropriate. Everything has to eat. But mindlessly smashing a defenseless bug, not acceptable. He sighed and looked in the direction that the girl had run. Sadly, it was the opposite way from where the humans lived. Oh, fuss and bother, he thought. Maybe I should fix this now before she gets further into my swamp and flattens even more creatures. He looked at the broken twigs and trampled grasses where he last saw her. He sniffed the air, ready to trap her. And when he found her, he figured out what to do. He winced as he stood up, his leg and arm frothed. He gently rubbed the sore spots. Nothing broken, he thought. He wouldn't be moving quickly today, though. And that was a problem because it meant the human would get further into the swamp before he could catch her. Still, he was sure of one thing. One way or another, the human must go. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Megan Bontrager, and today I'll be reading an excerpt from my novel Shrike, which is a retelling of the Medusa myth. Hi, my name is Megan Bontrager, and today I'll be reading an excerpt from my novel Shrike, which is a retelling of the Medusa myth. Manon had never thought to wonder what she might look like as a corpse. Not a body, an inanimate thing with no soul, but a corpse. Something that once was, but is no longer. She wondered how they might pretty and paint her, how they might lay her hair and rouge her cheeks. They'd button her up and tie her taut, folding her hands over lilies laid gently on her breast, and tell all the little cousins that came to pay respects that she was only sleeping. She saw Jolie now as a body. There was nothing of her soul there beneath the wire-shut smile and pinned-down eyes. This mirror of herself, this strange double, was nothing that had ever lived. She was a toy, a doll, a morbid and bastardized recreation of something that had once been beautiful and good. Her shoulders sat so snugly inside the casket, gaudy velvet that she wouldn't have wanted, with pearl bindings to keep the fabric laid flat. The casket's open top was vaulted like a cathedral ceiling, tall enough that Jolie could rise as she wished, looking around with wonder at her new home in the ground. It was all too much for something that was going in the earth. It was too much for Jolie. She wouldn't have wanted it. She had told Manon once that she'd wanted to become a tree. Jolie had wanted to be planted, to take root, to sprout something lovely. But now she was just dead, and Manon was alone, the thorny underside to Jolie's withering bloom. Manon's reflection in the mirror above Jolie's casket was strange, unfamiliar, warped. She caught glimpses of her expression twisting, reacting to the sounds of the overfull funeral hall like a wraith shying from the light. The voices of their shrill aunts were grating and harsh, though they lingered by the liquor cabinet in the far corner. Jolie's roommates wept quietly, dedicated to the theatricality of mourning. Manon could hardly produce tears herself. She had already spent them all. Jolie's friends should have stayed in Dublin. Their tears were voyeuristic, a well filled by commiseration. If they loved her as deeply as they portrayed, Jolie would be alive. If they burned for her, ached for her, they would have saved her. But the same could be said for Manon. The mortician regarded them all as if he beheld the crown jewel at an art show, gauging each face to ensure that they were all just touched enough by the sight of Jolie's corpse in her ostentatious velvet mummification. Manon watched as the spindly man made of too much limb and not enough torso flitted from group to group. He was like a bug, buzzing condolences in ears that were too busy to swat. No matter how proud this man was of his meticulous work, there was no hiding the wound that peeked out from beneath Jolie's hairline. There was no magical cure for a gaping head wound, apparently. But the way the mortician spoke, he seemed to think that he'd healed her with a bit of concealer and a little hairspray. It was a strange thing to see Jolie smiling in her forever sleep with a telling bloom of a bruise and a fissure beneath her hair. It didn't match. Manon itched to reach into the casket and mold her with her hands to make her fit. Whether that meant turning her lips downward or pressing together the seams of the wound more tightly, she didn't know. She had spoken to Jolie on the phone mere hours before her body had been found. She called Manon in the middle of the night, and Manon had considered her far too sober and far too loud for the ungodly hour. In the bathroom of the club beneath the railroad, Manon had pressed her hand over her ear and her phone to her cheek and listened. She'd barely registered what Jolie had said, mumbling half replies into her makeup-smeared cell phone and wandering out into the sweat-drenched fray again as soon as the line had gone dead. "I'm scared," Jolie had said. "I'm scared." In the morning that followed, Manon had risen to the sound of ocean waves, her phone half dead on the nightstand. She'd taken her time dressing for the ritual of her morning run, slathering sunscreen onto her tattoos and plaiting her hair in 2 matching rows atop her head. She'd nursed an energy drink and scrolled Twitter, texted Jolie. She felt unsettled, restless, her head throbbing and neck aching. She'd attributed it to a poor night's sleep and thought nothing of it. But she'd been cold. Far too cold for a summer morning on the coast. She should have known then. Twins were supposed to know that sort of thing. And when her mother had called, too stricken to form the full word, dead, Manon had thrown her phone into the sea, watching with open horror as her mother, still wailing, still sobbing, arced through the air and into the waves. She hadn't replaced the phone that she'd lost in the surf. There was no one she wished to talk to. Her Facebook and Twitter were flooded with half-hearted and overwrought messages of condolence, some from old friends and others from passing acquaintances who had only messaged Manon to feel good about themselves. None of the messages had been answered, though all had been opened. Manon had hoped to sift through them all to find a pop of confetti or a deluge of balloons. A "just kidding" or a "gotcha" would suffice. But it was no cruel joke. Jolie was dead, and Manon was not. It should have been the other way around. Thank you.
My name is Cheyenne Leonardo. I'll be reading an excerpt from a short piece of memoir entitled Searching for Words. My daddy is a man of few words. At least that's what they say about men who don't have a lot to say. And some say it's a good thing to be of few words. It means you don't make a big deal about yourself. It means you never say too much, but always just enough. Well, it's true, my daddy doesn't say much. When we take our places at the dinner table, just the 3 of us, and me and my mama prattle on and on about something or someone, my daddy doesn't say anything. But he has his own way with words. My daddy sits behind a bowl of steaming soup beans and crumbles warm, buttery cornbread fresh out of the cast iron skillet into his dish. He wears his reading glasses low on the bridge of his big nose, and sprawled out before him, taking precedence over his supper, lies a book of word searches. Red pen in hand, he scratches out chains of letters in bleeding crimson lines. I peek across the table at the book. Today's theme, simply heroic. Description. The real hero isn't the guy on the white horse with the sword in his hand. It's the honest Joe who exercises these unflashy but solid virtues. Joe, my mama says, how are the beans? Pretty good, he says. The highest compliment he will bestow upon our cooking. And he saves such praise for just 2 meals, soup beans and chicken and dumplings. The fresh fish on Friday, or the macaroni casserole, or the sausage and peppers will only yield an all right or a fair. But even that usually comes tacked on to and it's missing something. And usually what it's missing is salt, even though he always tells me not to put it in because he's not supposed to eat too much salt. So he will salt his food and then he will eat his whole meal without looking up from his puzzles, all the while searching for words and saying almost none at all. According to today's list of words, one of the virtues characterizing Honest Joe is quiet. Q-U-I-E-T, my daddy finds it and scratches it out, letter by letter in red pen. Peace and quiet, my daddy used to say as we took our places at the table. I want some peace and quiet this evening. That was long before the word searches and red pens. And in those days, when the TV set only came on after we finished eating supper, I would swing my dirty bare feet underneath the table and I would talk anyway. My daddy never complained unless I tried to balance my chair on its 2 hind legs. Don't rear back in the chair, he would say. You'll fall and bust your head, Taterbug. Back then, he had funny nicknames for me. Half Pint, Nimrod, Taterbug. Taterbug was my favorite. I imagined myself small and red with black spots crawling around the sprouting eyes of the potato. I liked the way my daddy put words together and the way they rolled out of his mouth like marbles. After supper, I sit on my bed and dump out a box of words printed on tiny rectangular magnets. I, too, search for words. I pick them out of little piles and arrange them on metal boards and try to connect them, coax new meaning from them. I have a finite number of words with which I can create something new. There's something freeing about the limitations of a single box of words. You asked me then, between the rose-red moon and a raven dream, and I whispered, half delirious, we are as you believe. Sing us into the earth, I said, echo our love through the honey sky. There is no blood lost together, say you want to try. Word by word, I piece poems together so I can hush my head, so I can see myself better, so I can let something out, something that wants to live outside of me. Thank you.
Patrick tonight, a final round of applause. Before we release, I would like our readers to come up front so that we can get a picture of you. Thank you, all of you in the audience, friends, supporters, parents, faculty, alumni. Wonderful to have you here live again.